Hey, what's up, friends? Welcome back to Culture Binge, the Wisecrack podcast, where we try really hard to understand the moods and machinations of the cultural zeitgeist. I'm your host, Michael Burns. Serby is off this week, so we have one of the hosts of Wisecrack's movie podcast, Show Me the Meaning, and a connoisseur of all things horrifying and spooky, Raymond Creamer. Raymond, how are you today?
Doing well. Happy to be back, Michael.
Always happy to have you here. But even happier than that, I'm happy that we're joined by a very special guest, staff writer for The Ringer, where she writes about culture in general and television in specific, Alison Herman. Alison, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. That was such a exciting hold music. I was doing a little dance in my in my desk chair.
I'm very obsessed with that music. I still don't have a copy of it myself. I wish I did. So today we're going to talk about a few things. We'll talk about television getting lost in translation, and we're going to talk about the boundaries between friendship, art, and brutally honest shit talking. But first of all, Alison, as a way to introduce you to our audience and stuff like that, I have a question for you. This is something I didn't prep you for. Are you a person that consumes spooky content this time of year? Is that something you seek out? Are you a Halloween viewer of things, or is that something that you are not interested in?
It's funny that you ask, because I sort of have a theory that my micro generation of younger millennials was just permanently turned off of horror, because when we came of age, that was the peak torture porn, Saw, Hostel, really over the top gory stuff. And that was the horror that was in theaters when I was a young kid, and you usually get hooked on that kind of thing. So I was historically totally anti-spooky. And then as an adult, I both, went back and discovered stuff like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And also that was when that sort of artsy A24, It Follows, The Witch, subtle spooky started. So I've been slowly easing myself in with the work of Ari Aster, and I'm not quite spooky season level yet, but I'm trying to get there.
Well, I find that very comforting, because I was worried I was going to be on the line with two big spooky aficionados right now. I find that relatable. I think I'm an old millennial and not a young millennial, but I do relate to what you're saying there, because the whole horror torture porn thing was not really my vibe. I veered more into the sort of cutesy Wes Anderson aesthetic in many things, film based, when I was in my formative years. Now, Raymond, I don't have to ask you your thoughts on spooky things, but because this will be, our main episode before we get right up against Halloween, I had to give you an opportunity to give a few spooky recs.
A few spooky recs?
Yeah, or you can even just tell us what you do during spooky season, what sort of media you're consuming. I just felt like it would be a disservice to not at least give you a chance to quickly share some things with us.
Sure.
Quickly being the operative term, but
okay, I'll do my best. Every October, I marathon. I've been doing a marathon of marathons. Most days in October, I'll watch 3 or 4 fright flicks. Just loving getting into some deep cuts, filling in some blind spots from before. But if you're looking for some good introductory pieces, there's a new film out in theaters right now called Titan. It's directed by Julia Ducournau, and her first film, Raw, is one of my favorite movies ever. I think it's just a really bracing and beautiful.
It's on Netflix right now, I think, as well.
Yeah, and quite aptly titled. It's a very raw artistic expression. It's available on Netflix. Check it out if you haven't. I would also say a movie we covered on Show Me the Meaning this time last year, Jennifer Kent's The Babadook, one of the great paranormal movies of the past decade. I really love that. And I'm trying to think of one more. Oh, on Netflix, I just recently watched Under the Shadow, which is a great Iranian ghost film. So check those out maybe. They're pretty easy to find.
I might. This is the year where I'm trying to make myself consume some spooky things. So I'll try to keep it up. Anyone who has spooky stuff they let us know. Before we get into the topics, we will do our perennial love to hate segment, Slaps and Chaps. This is where we talk about something that's happened recently, something that's going on in our lives and culture and society that we're really excited about, and something that we're not enjoying so much. Raymond, we'll get started with you. What are your Slaps and Chaps for this episode?
Well, in In accordance with one of our topics today, I am committing a stunning act of generosity in donating my slaps and chaps time to Maddie. Now, she's a little microphone shy, but she told me before we started recording, she's got a couple of slaps right now.
Amazing. And this is our producer, Maddie, for anyone who isn't familiar with her. She's the most important person that's in this podcast, even if you don't often hear her.
Yes, Culture Binge producer Maddie. 2 slaps real quick. Only Murders in the Building, she said, is very good. I haven't watched it yet, but I love Steve Martin and Martin Short. And my girlfriend said the few episodes she's watched have been pretty fun, so I've got to check it out. She also said that she bought a bunch of stuff online recently and actually returned it all after she decided she didn't want it anymore. So she kind of wanted to give herself a little pat on the back for that one. And Maddie's chap this week, or actually for the past 2 weeks, is that she went to Sweet Green 3 times over the past fortnight, and every single time they were out of fish. So Sweet Green, get your act together. Maddie's not having it. You're on notice.
You got to get that fish taco bowl. It's one of the best things on the menu. One of those, I don't know if it's one of those journeys. I did run into Maddie at Sweet Green recently. It was a really formative experience for me. And I think we did get the same thing that time. I have to ask this while we're on the topic, just very quickly, Allison, thoughts on Only Murders in the Building?
Oh, I strong cosign. I used to live in New York. I went to college there, and I in fact went to college like 2 or 3 subway stops away from the all the Upper West Side big named buildings that it's clearly riffing on. And so it gives me a lot of nostalgia on top of the huge nostalgia of just seeing Steve Martin and Martin Short be themselves. And I think it's incredibly sweet and like surprisingly emotionally resonant, even when like the jokes actually land. I was sort of surprised by how much I've been really loving it.
I'm on board with you and Maddie on that one as well. And I've really enjoyed the week to week model of it. It is so much fun to like forget a new episode's coming and go on Hulu and see that there's a new one. We need more week to week shows. I guess, there's examples of that, but great. Now for you, do you have some slaps and chaps for us, Allison?
Well, I will pick up on your week-to-week model observation, which I co-sign. And one of my favorite week-to-week shows is coming back this Sunday. It's a little show called Succession. A little obscure. Maybe you haven't heard of it. But yeah, I have been lucky enough as a result of my job to watch 7 of the 9 episodes in advance. And
overwhelming jealousy.
Yeah, I mean, it was overwhelming to me. I made the mistake of watching 2 in a row and like literally did not sleep well at night. So it remains very intense, very funny. I obviously am sworn to secrecy about everything that happens, but I think I'm allowed to say it kind of picks up exactly where last season left off 2 very long years ago and just immediately starts going at warp speed. And so I think people are going to be really happy it's back. I certainly am.
Oh my God, cannot wait. And do you have a negative thing as well? Did you bring a chap with you, or are you bringing full positive energy?
I wouldn't be me if I wasn't bringing like a little bit of negative energy into the room. But yeah, I wrote about Dave Chappelle's last stand-up special a couple years ago and got some, borderline online harassment. So in the safety of a podcast and not a written form, I think I can say I watched some of his latest special, The Closer, on Netflix, which has earned some controversy for his continued doubling down on his views about trans people. And it's really frustrating to watch because Dave Chappelle is obviously a master at what he does and continues to have, nuggets of really amazing comedy even in these specials. It's just the fact that he's continually obsessed with this topic and keeps bringing it up and keeps not modifying his view of it at all means that there's less and less to focus on in the specials besides the arguable transphobia. And that spilled over to a controversy within Netflix this week where a trans employee who had spoken out about her view of the special on Twitter was suspended ostensibly for attending a meeting of higher level executives she wasn't invited to. I believe her name's Tara Field. And that whole mess is not something I was super excited about this week. And I hope that Netflix continues to think critically about how it's using its platform. And my cat is zooming around the room, so I guess he's not
That's
happy
amazing.
either.
Yeah, the cat is also not a fan of the new Chappelle special. So, no, totally. I think that the discourse around that has been very frustrating and exhausting this week. I skipped around the special, but I couldn't find myself ready to dig in. And if anyone has watched or hasn't watched it, I found a Craig Jenkins piece in Vulture really, really good. It kind of like getting to the heart of why it feels so bad to watch Chappelle right now and why it's hard to see him continue to go back to that well of digging into transphobia as a source of humor. It's pretty disappointing. So
it's especially disheartening because, like you said, Allison, he is undeniably a master of his craft, and even among comedians, he has a reputation for being the kind of guy who can find good, incisive humor in almost anything, and it just seems like he's doubled down or just kind of like almost like taking his toys and going home in a weird way. It just feels really, really weird and defensive the way that he's approached all of this. But I haven't watched the new special, so I can't speak to his current comments or anything like that.
Yeah, it's a bad vibe. I guess I'll move on to my slaps and chaps. I feel bad saying something positive now, but I have a very silly slap. So I did something. I've talked about this in the podcast before. I've been very proud of being a carless Los Angeles resident, and I changed that after 4.5 years. And at least
moved out of Los
in the short term,
Angeles.
I don't live in Los Angeles anymore. Now I'm just a carless resident of I don't know, San Bernardino. No, I did acquire a vehicle. It came with a free subscription of Sirius XM radio. I know this is a thing that like boomer parents around the country have known about for a very long time. What a fun service. Really enjoyed it. It makes me want to like drive around a bit. And I kind of get now why people like being stuck in their cars so much when you have access to so many fun things. Like there's old comedy stations, there's full stations for the Grateful Dead and Jimmy Buffett and all other types of things. I did accidentally give my mother-in-law a ride to the airport when I left a kind of aggressive early 90s rap station on where they were having some really choice commentary. But I've really enjoyed it. I think I will soon regret acquiring a car for a variety of reasons. But for these first 3 months, the Sirius XM trial
Definitely been worth
is making it all worth it. Yeah.
Do you think you'll carry on after the trial's over?
I don't even know how much it cost. I haven't looked. I got the email that said we're offering you this. Do either of you know how much this stuff costs? I imagine it's expensive.
I mean, speaking of boomer parents, my dad is an aggressive user of Sirius XM in general and the Grateful Dead station in particular.
Oh.
So...
He and Michael would get along.
Yeah, we'll get him on a future podcast episode and we can talk about those things. And in my chap, it's related. I got played at the car dealership and getting ready to acquire a vehicle. I read probably hundreds of pages of silly articles on all types of websites about like how to not get taken advantage of, what to say, what to do, what not to do. I basically worked myself up as if I was playing a character at the dealership, and I was playing the character of someone who knows what he wants, who isn't going to get manipulated, who knows when to say no. And I just got steamrolled so badly by the gentleman who worked there, and he played me because he played the card of I'm casual, I'm just your buddy, I get it, like that sort of thing. I let all of my guards down, and I got bullied into paying money for something I didn't want to pay for, and now I'm working up the courage to call the dealership to talk to the same man to try to cancel the thing.
Oh boy.
Just horrible. And you think as an adult, like how hard can it be to make a purchase where you just say, no, thank you, I will not have the prepaid maintenance thing. And he just kept telling me that I couldn't say no. And I eventually acquiesced, and I'm very ashamed.
He just dazzled you with that Sirius subscription, man.
He didn't even tell me about that. That just was, he threw that in as a side thing, but just very, very ashamed. And I still don't understand why car buying can't be simple. But before we get into our topics, if I was going to review my experience at, I guess I won't say the name of the car dealership, but with that person, I would probably give it a 3 out of 5 star experience because of that. But hopefully this podcast is a 5 out of 5 experience. And if so, please like, subscribe, review, all those things. It means a lot to us. It helps us out. So do that, whether you listen to it on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, or any other podcast app that I am not aware of. And like we always say, if you want to leave a review, have fun with it. Tell us what we would be in some categorization of thing, and we will read it on the episode. So Please do that if you get a chance. It means a lot to us. And if you have a podcast, let us know what it is in the review, and we'll go give it a good review too after listening, because we have integrity. But speaking of integrity, this is a horrible transition. We got to talk about Squid Game. I think it is now officially the most watched thing ever on Netflix. I think I saw a number like 111 million viewers or something like that. Which is
across 90 countries, I think. Something insane. That can't be right, can it?
Well, so Netflix famously counts like a view as watching 2 minutes of a single episode. Okay. And for context, when you hear like a Nielsen rating, those are average viewers per minute over like an entire broadcast. So I think Netflix viewing numbers are useful relatively. Like, I believe them that more people watch Squid Game than watch Bridgerton, which was their biggest show before that. But that doesn't mean 111 million people watched all 9 episodes or even all of a single episode.
Sure.
That's very helpful context. So I assume at this point, everyone who would listen to this podcast has at least watched some Squid Game, South Korean show. And I'll just say, I think it's pretty good. I think there's some problems with it. I think it's maybe not as good as people want to think it is, but a very good show, does a lot of interesting things. But one of the things that's popped up in the discourse around it is the issue of the subtitles and the translation of the show. So I'm sure a lot of us have seen this. There is an article that we will link to in the description. That's from NBC News about this. But so a lot of native Korean speakers have pointed out that there's big disparity between the dialogue in the show and what shows up in the English subtitles, in both a very literal sense and also in a context-based sense, where specific cultural references are left out or rephrased in a different way. I have seen both sides of this. There's been a lot of conversation where people think this is a bad thing and doing a disservice to the writers and the actors and the culture as a whole, while others think that maybe this is getting a little bit overblown and the show is still enjoyable and you can't really, make everyone happy all the time. I have thoughts on this. I'm curious what you all think about, and I guess if we want to say quickly what we all think about the show, we can do that as well. But I'm curious what y'all think about Squid Game, and then what we think about the issue or non-issue with the translations. Alison, start with you if that's cool, as an esteemed guest.
I would love to. I mean, first of all, I should mention I've seen 7 of the 9 episodes. Given my aforementioned difficulty with, overtly scary content, I've been taking it pretty slow, even though one of the things I really enjoy about Squid Game is that, like a lot of Korean popular culture, I think it is willing to be a lot more violent and gory and over the top right off the bat than a lot of American TV. I mean, like in the first challenge, like half the contestants are eliminated. And I remember seeing that and being like, that would never ever happen. Like when we had Hunger Games and that was a huge thing, that was nowhere near as over the top and bloody. And I really like that about the show. As for the subtitles, I think it's really fascinating just as a issue that comes up when a piece of non-American, non-English speaking entertainment becomes such a massive hit in a culture that it did not originate from. I should obviously clarify right off the bat, I am not a native Korean speaker, nor, unless I'm mistaken, is anyone else on this podcast. But I think the way I react when I seen some of the videos, I know the comedian Youngmi Mayer on TikTok was one of the first people who brought this up as an issue. And I think I am really appreciative of the additional context, and I simply would probably frame it differently personally, in the sense that when I learn additional, bits of context, like the kind of lower class female character saying, I didn't go to school, but I still have a lot of smarts, and her explaining that that's a trope in Korean entertainment. I think my reaction to that is less, oh my God, shame on Netflix for not accurately communicating that, and more, oh, that's interesting. I think this is sort of a challenge with any kind of translation. And I think Netflix is really unique in that it instantly makes all this entertainment available with subtitles in dozens of languages instantly. That's a giant undertaking. I don't think that's a simple or easy thing. And I'm not surprised that there are some hiccups in that process. And I think for me, it's more, oh, interesting, that's tricky, and less like, oh, shame on Netflix. But also, I'm not really in a place to tell anyone that they shouldn't be offended by what they see as a misrepresentation of their culture. So that's only my point of view on this.
Yeah, and I think a good point in general that none of us are native Korean speakers. None of us, I assume, are super familiar with that culture, have lived in South Korea before. So all coming in from that perspective. Raymond, what do you think?
About the show in general, I've enjoyed the few episodes that I've watched so far. You brought up Hostel and Saw earlier, Allison. I'm not a huge fan of horror or genre stuff that goes straight for kind of sadism. So at times, while I appreciate the thematic undertones of Squid Game, there have been some episodes where I'm just like, this just doesn't really do it for me. With regards to the translation issues, I think there's stuff like in the first episode that you referenced where they play the game that is sort of red light, green light. I understand how, because translation and subtitling is a very delicate and difficult art to pull off. It's tough to navigate, giving all the context and making sure that the story is clear. And with something like that, where red light, green light is such an easy analog for an American audience, you can understand why they maybe do something like that. But also, I think it betrays a lack of faith in the audience a little bit too, that you could just have a more direct translation of that game, which I've read is what they're saying is something about a flower blossoming. My girlfriend, who's a Korean speaker, she usually during Korean movies or TV shows, she will kind of give like a Korean commentary where, because the nature of subtitling is so difficult, she'll lean over at times and say, oh, okay, the thing to understand here is that this aspect of the culture is difficult to fit into a subtitle, but the way that he's saying this betrays a certain kind of personality or what have you. So this is a common thing with movies, but even she said that the Squid Game stuff is especially egregious. And I feel like you could, with that red light, green light example, just for one, you could probably count on the audience to sort of pick up on the mechanics of the game, even if they're not saying the same thing that we would say over here. When the doll is turned around, you're allowed to move, and when the doll's looking at you, you have to stop. We all understand that, even if we don't understand the exact cues that they're playing by. So I think on one hand, like you said, Allison, if folks are offended by it or if they feel it's misrepresented their culture, obviously that's one conversation, and that's a pressing issue that should be worked through. On the other hand, I think it also just betrays a real lack of confidence in the audience that's receiving it stateside. But I don't know. What do you think, Michael?
Well, I do wonder, because I think like translation is a weird issue, right? Because you have the literalization of, how literally will we take what someone is saying and translate it? And there's also this whole other background of sort of cultural references and assumptions and things that take place when a piece of art is made from a culture outside of your own. And I think that translation is sometimes maybe not appreciated for kind of like the subjective art it is, and is often treated as the subjective, almost like mathematical form of translation.
Just stick it into Google Translate. It'll turn out. Yeah.
And I, in a different part of my life when I was in grad school, was a part of a translation project once. And, you do see when you're doing translation, it doesn't work if you go super literally. In this example, I was part of translating a part of a book from a French author, and there are just cultural references, turns of phrase, examples that just do not make sense if you do not know that particular point of reference in French language or culture. So you have to, as a translator, take some liberties in how you present things. And I have a good friend who translates a lot of Italian text, and we'll often talk about this. Like, you can't just do the Google Translate version of it. Go ahead, Allison.
Oh, I was just going to bring up that, I think it's interesting that especially in the literary realm, certain translators are almost considered co-authors. I'm thinking of, Ken Liu with The Three Body Problem, and Goldstein with Elena Ferrante's books, or even, non-literary in a non-literary forum, I mean, there's a reason why Bong Joon-ho's translator, Sharon, became this huge pop cultural figure during his Oscar tour, because she was obviously an incredibly important figure in his kind of media presentation throughout that entire award season that culminated in Parasite winning Best Picture. And I think, you know, there's a reason why those people are elevated to almost co-authors of the text, because it's an incredibly laborious, time-intensive process. And as I mentioned, I think like the speed and comprehensiveness of Netflix translation does not necessarily make me surprised that there are certain kinks and shortcuts that are taken. And for me, it's almost more about the process and more about, you know, what inevitably happens when you make this available on a huge global platform, which simultaneously, I think, enabled its incredible cross-cultural success, but also just inevitably leads to certain roadblocks along the way.
Yeah. And I think I don't say this to give Netflix any leeway or any bit of a cop-out, because I'm very sure they do not. I'll make a wild assumption. I'm sure they don't pay their translators as much as they should, and I'm sure they don't give them as much time and resources as they should, because it's Netflix. But I mean, I do think there is an aspect sometimes of consuming things from a culture outside of our own, even if it's in the English language, that can create the space to learn more about that context. You know, I lived in the UK for a while, and I definitely know that, like, after living in the UK for almost a decade, I just understood things in TV shows and movies that I definitely did not understand when I first got there. And especially with a lot of English content, there's so many like class-based subtleties that just don't make sense to the average American audience. And I think that it's been interesting to like learn more about that. Or even my partner was reading the most recent Sally Rooney book, and there's a line in that book where this doesn't spoil anything for anyone, where a character refers to someone and her mom having to take the boat to England for the weekend, which in a very literal sense sounds like a person and their mother took a boat to England. And in Irish context, that's the way people talk about people getting abortions, because before abortion was legal in Ireland, the standard thing is you would like leave Dublin or wherever on a ferry to go to Liverpool, England, to get an abortion and come back. So that's like a phrase used there. So so I think like some of the things in Squid Game, and especially the stuff that has to do with like the relationship between, and I thought this stuff was interesting. Like there's the character Ali from Pakistan. And I think that often, I don't know, like I don't know a lot about how, you know, South Asian workers who are in South Korea, doing sort of like looking like under the table labor. I knew nothing about how people like that are treated there, and was something that like I did Google about and read about, and it was interesting. I think one of the characters who is from North Korea, like I truly did not know that it was a linguistic thing where if you are North Korean, the way you speak even sort of like, you know, shows you out in society the way that I guess someone from South Boston would sound if they were in Georgia. I don't know. That's a dumb example, but
no,
I think
that's a great example. That so was something. Oh, go ahead.
No, so just saying, translation aside, I think that the interesting thing is it creates the opportunity as an audience to learn some stuff. Maybe I'm just trying to justify that anthropology degree as an undergrad, but like there's something interesting about using things like this as an opportunity to learn about culture, which does not take Netflix and their translation practices off the hook.
No, that the North Korean dialect was something my girlfriend pointed out early on before that's even directly addressed in the series, and that's something that even if I had read tons about the history of Korea and had a really good understanding of its culture, without living there or without being around a bunch of Korean speakers from different regions, I would not have any semblance of that. I wouldn't have the ear for dialects like that. So there's always going to be something lost in translation a little bit. Michael, you mentioned Wes Anderson earlier. There's that great line in Bottle Rocket where he tells Luke Wilson as he's translating for a different Spanish speaker, he goes, "You're like trash, man." And Luke Wilson goes, "What?" And he goes, "You're like paper floating by." And they just kind of stand there awkwardly for a moment before he shrugs his shoulders and goes, "I don't know, it sounds better in Spanish, dude." There's always going to be some aspect of that, but I agree with you. Netflix should and could do a much better job of not only honoring the work, but not only honoring the work of the filmmakers, but the work of the translators as well.
Yeah, I guess to quickly, just before we wrap up, touch back to something Allison said really early on about A24 horror films and that genre. Makes me think of the movie Lamb, which I saw over the
Very
weekend,
enjoyable.
and which I thought was a very enjoyable movie. But there were some parts of it, in reading some of the reviews afterwards, I was like, oh, some of this is pointing to like Icelandic myths that
Sure.
someone from Iceland would watch and be like, oh, that's referring to this foundational story from my childhood. And even there, it was just like, this is a thing that I just had no context for because I don't know a lot about Icelandic culture, which is interesting to know now. Although that one was easy translation wise because the characters say about 13 words.
They don't say
film.
as much. Funny enough, at I went to the Beyond Fest screening of that, and during the Q&A, I actually asked the director if there was anything in the movie from his culture or his background historically that he thinks we maybe had missed as an audience, and he's like, yeah, man, I'm sure there are, but the monster in it, such as it is, he's like, that's not from any specific Icelandic lore. That was just kind of something we had for the movie. But it's always good just to be on the lookout for that sort of thing, because like you said, Michael, even if it's not something that immediately reaches out and grabs you and says like, oh, this has got to be something, if you look it up later, you can find all kinds of cool, really like story cul-de-sacs and weird little things from folklore that that add up to the experience of the film.
Yeah, I mean, Michael, what you were saying earlier specifically about British entertainment and class, I found that really interesting because, I mean, as an American, you would assume British entertainment is sort of the easiest for us to grasp. There's a common language, there are other common cultural links. And even that, I think, commonly results in certain misconnections. I was actually thinking about, I was watching Bake Off, which on top of, being from a similar culture is also like literally the most straightforward, sweet, accessible thing you could possibly imagine. And I remember early on in the season, Noel Fielding, the host, is talking to Prue Leith, the judge, and there's a contestant named Maggie, who they're joking looks a lot like Prue, but part of the joke is also that she sounds a lot like Prue, and they both have a really, really, really posh upper class accent. And Noel says something like, oh, I've never felt more like a chimney sweep in my life when I'm talking to the two of you. Which is really funny, but I think that was a more overt class reference. And I think that is a really interesting, Bake Off's whole point is that it's supposed to represent all of Britain, and people are from all sorts of regions and have all sorts of accents. And as a viewer in America, I think it can be kind of funny and anthropological, but there are also a lot of kind of subtle bits of cultural dialogue that come from that cross-section that you can miss. And if we're missing that from the Great British Bake Off, I can't even imagine what we're missing from Squid Game or Lamb or Parasite or anything else.
Yeah, it does make me think. I remember the big point for me was learning from a British friend that the Spice Girls were constructed to represent every different class faction of British society at that point, and having no sense of that when I was a teen in America. And it was like, no, this person represents that. This person represents that. And like, oh, Sporty Spice, she's a chav, which means a sort of like working class white person that lives in this area. And it was like, no idea about any of this.
I remember watching Blue is the Warmest Color in theaters. And part of that, in addition to being a lesbian romance, it's supposed to be like an interclass romance. And I remember watching it as an American, and the allegedly lower class character at one point, you're supposed to tell they're lower class because they're watching TV over dinner, but they're also eating a home cooked pasta dinner as a family. So as an American, I'm like, oh, they already seem like they're super fancy. Like they're not eating takeout. Yeah. They're all together. It's not, and there are certain things that I missed until like maybe halfway through the movie when it becomes a little more overt.
Well, that's the horrible thing, right? In European films, they could be lower class and they're still like going to the doctor and not paying money for it. So before we move on, I have a confession to make, and that is that when I was a kid, one of the first things I learned that got me into pop culture and reading about like entertainment, and especially a little bit of like gossip, was I would always steal my mother's People magazines and was very obsessed with them. I didn't want my dad to see me reading them because he probably wanted me reading Sports Illustrated or Newsweek or something. But I say that because I'm very excited that we are doing something fun with People magazine right now. So I wanted to tell everyone about a new show that I think you'll love, which is People Magazine's and People Every Day. It's a new podcast, and it's hosted by editor-at-large Janine Rubenstein. On People Every Day, we get a mix of the most popular celebrity and inspirational human interest stories, mixed with entertainment news, exclusive interviews, and featured stories. From unpacking Britney Spears' conservatorship, I imagine something a lot of us have been keeping up to date with, and culture scandals to interviews with stars like Julianne Moore, The Rock, Chelsea Clinton, and more. People Every Day is your daily dose of pop culture and what makes us human. So check that podcast out if you haven't already. I'm excited that we have some sort of, podcast-based friendship with People Magazine. I can't wait to tell my mom. I think she's finally going to be proud of me. That might be the thing that does it. So check that out if you get a chance. Now, speaking of some things that happened amongst people,
I'll say, speaking of human interest stories, yeah.
Yes, my transition game is just fantastic. So we're going to talk about Bad Art Friend. Okay, so for anyone who doesn't know, but you probably know, this is a New York Times story. It's written by Robert Kolker. Came out last week. In general, this was a thing I was hesitant to talk about because it's a little bit like, okay, did we miss the zeitgeisty cultural wave? Are we just in the wake of this thing, holding on to scraps? But sometimes I like thinking about things like this after the initial wave of, of tweet storms and everything else. So I'm excited to talk about this. For anyone who doesn't know, written by Robert Kolker, it's a story about two writers, Dawn Dorland and Sonia Larson. One of these, I guess the TLDR would be that Dorland donated a kidney, and she made a Facebook page about her kidney donation and was pretty, I guess, public facing about it. She reached out to her former writing colleague, Sonia Larson, when Larson didn't acknowledge, I think, on Facebook, the kidney donation. Larson later wrote a short story about a kidney donation that Dorland thought was cribbing from her own life. Litigation ensued. Text messages were revealed. It's one of the most interesting 10,000 word stories about people that you maybe had not heard of beforehand. And I will say, if you don't want to read 10,000 words, there's an audio feature on the New York Times thing, which is very nice because you could listen to it as well. I don't know. There's a lot of things to talk about here, but I guess I'll start with this. Alison, was this something that you read day one and were sort of participating in the storm of commentary about?
I mean, as someone who considers themselves, to use a scientific term, terminally online, I read this the moment it was online and immediately took to like 7 separate group chats. I mean, I think the main thing about the story is it is so addictive. It just immediately scratches that like deep primal itch of schadenfreude and gossip and just enough ambiguity that everyone can argue for a week straight about who's right and who's wrong, even if the simple and very obvious answer is they're both wrong in different ways. And there are so many issues contained within the story about, I almost think the least interesting one is the, top line focus of whether it's ethical to use real life sources for your art. And I think the far more interesting stuff happens, I think the inciting incident of the story, the kidney donation and how Dawn handled it publicly, I think is speaking to a lot of people's, the way public displays of virtue make people uncomfortable, the question of how public Dawn was, because she did make a Facebook group just to talk about her kidney donation, but it was private and relatively small. But I'm already just getting into the weeds of the story. My point is just, it is so fascinating. And I think the most irritating response of it to me has been like, why is this a story? Why do people care? This is so random. This is so petty. And I don't think being petty is an obstacle to making something interesting. In fact, I think it's exactly what makes something interesting, because the stakes are so low financially and artistically, but they're so high personally. And that means that we all know a Dawn or a Sonia or both. And that just meant everyone had something to contribute to the conversation. So I am all here for this discourse. I have been really enjoying it, probably more than I should. And I'm curious what you guys think.
Yeah, Raymond, how about you? What was your initial exposure and reaction to the Bad Art Friend discourse?
I think, like a lot of folks, my first exposure to it was just people tweeting about it and seeing Bad Art Friend trending, and I probably clicked on it just because Bad Art Friend sounds like a weird set of trigger words, like to send a Manchurian Candidate on a kill spree or something. And just reading the tweets about it, the basic gist that I got was, oh, a lady donated a kidney, which I don't want to minimize. Like that's a very bold and courageous thing to do, especially for a stranger. But then she took it pretty far in terms of kind of self-congratulation and was looking for validation wherever she could find it. And I think that certainly makes for an interesting character at the center of a story. But I didn't read any further because, like most of these things, I figured it would just kind of have its moment on Twitter and then disappear. When we decided to cover it on the show, I gave the article a read and dismayed at first to find out how long it was. And then once I started reading, like you said, Alison, it was just like, boom, it was game over. It is a pretty fascinating story. And I was actually surprised at how deep it went into these notions of creative license and ownership. Because all I had heard on Twitter was just like, kidney lady wants attention, blah, 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 blah. But yeah, reading through it is one of those things, like you said, Alison, people may diminish this as a puff piece or a weird thing to write such a long article about, or, does this qualify as serious journalism? But as a human interest story, the story really is in the telling. Is this interesting for me to hear about at a party as a bit of gossip? Sure. But if you had told me, oh, then someone's going to write a novella length article about that, I'd say, I don't know. I don't know if there's enough meat on the bone. But it reminds me a lot of like The Accidental Billionaires in a way, like just this very, very weird,
the
sterile
Facebook book.
Yeah, that's the one that Social Network was based on. Mm-hmm. Just these kind of weird, sterile people who have this intense personal animosity that seems so isolating on the surface. But once you get into it, you're like, oh, there's a whole lot more under the hood here than I think folks are giving it credit for.
Yeah, I mean, I really liked how, in reading this, because I kind of did the thing where I saw, woke up whatever morning that was, and Twitter was abuzz. And then before I read it, saw a lot of people then sort of having discussions about the ethics of group texting. And I saw a bunch of tweets that were like, you should really ask yourself if you're the type of person that says these things in group text. Other people were very much like, no, it's completely normal and good to do that. Get off your high horses. So I was like, wow, this is what we're doing. And then in reading it, I found it, like the first time through, I did the thing where my brain wanted to decide who the good person was and who the bad person was very early on. And I will be honest, I made a firm decision about like 200 words in, but just only because like, and I know that Dorland herself is Midwestern, so it's weird to say this, but the Midwesterner in me was just like, you don't do that. If you want to give a kidney, you give it, and then you shut up about it. You don't start like a Facebook page and brag about it. So I was so put off by that. And of course, when they get into the initial stuff with Larson's response to that, I was just like, yeah, I too would be very mad if I got an email from a friend that was like, hey, Michael, I did a good thing and I noticed you didn't like pat me on the back. I would just be like, Jesus Christ. But as it goes on, it does get a lot more complicated. I think, like you said, Alison, the use of the letter is almost insignificant by the end of it. And I thought the real interesting stuff was kind of the pivot when you see, so in the article, for anyone who hasn't read it, we get to see some email exchanges between the two main characters, in which the author, Larson, is relatively like, I'm sorry if I upset you. I value our friendship, et cetera, et cetera. Later, when it gets litigious, we learn through some court documents that along this time she was on her group text with her friends being like, I can't believe she won't shut up about the fucking kidney. And all this sort of stuff. And then like Celeste Ng, the author of Little Fires Everywhere, was on the group text, which made it extra spicy that it's like, oh, this is a very famous writer who's also involved in this. I don't know. Like, I guess some of the stuff it left me wondering where, like, maybe the least interesting thing, like you said, is, are there such things as truly original ideas? Isn't everything a form of theft? Can anyone who's a part of a creative community really get mad about that stuff? But maybe the more interesting thing, or maybe trivial thing, I was thinking, like, what are the ethics of that type of I guess shit talk, or group text, sort of expression of these things. I mean, especially in creative communities, because I'm sure all of us have various group text where we talk about people in our various industries, or maybe I'm bad and you both are good. But, whether it's, someone who's a writer that writes a thing we don't like, or someone in one's field who has success, it is sort of so commonplace that reading the article left me thinking, like, is that bad? Is it good? Should I be rethinking these sort of things? So, I mean, I don't know, Alison, you mentioned being on like 7 group text about this immediately. So what is your relationship to that sort of thing? And how do you think about this almost like from the personal ethical level?
Yeah, I mean, I think the group texts, as I implied, are kind of similar to the group texts depicted in the article. A lot of them are kind of intra-industry. A lot of them are, sharing candid thoughts that I wouldn't necessarily share on a public platform. But I think, so for anyone who hasn't read the story, I think you came to the conclusion that you did because the story itself, I would say, is pretty conclusively Team Don is the bad guy, if not Team Sonia is the good guy. And I think it's because in the writer's telling of it, it's kind of like Don commits 2 sins to Sonia's 1 sin. And Don's first sin is being way too public and needy and in need of validation for something that was ostensibly a purely philanthropic and altruistic act of donating her kidney. And then she goes on the warpath when she is finally validated, literally years after Sonia publishes a short story featuring a woman who does a kidney donation, who's clearly a desperate white savior type in Sonia's telling. And when Dawn finds that out, she goes kind of on the legal warpath and tries to get Sonia disinvited from a bunch of professional organizations and tries to make sure she can't profit off the story. Not that she was, this is short stories we're talking about. It's not a huge amount of money that's on the line. And Sonia's one thing that she did wrong is being way too overt and lifting like verbatim passages from that letter, especially in early drafts of the story. An early draft of the story literally named the kidney donor Dawn. And if anything, her mistake, according to the article, is just kind of like not being subtle or inventive enough and just being, a little too much of a stenographer. And I think another reason why this is blown up is because it became an actual legal battle, which means there's a lot of very public records of exactly what happened and when, which means that reporters who are nosy and gossipy by nature and often go through court documents have now that they've been made aware of the story by this article, have gone back and kind of created their own timelines. So I will say Michael Hobbs, who's a popular podcast host, formerly of You're Wrong About, currently of Maintenance Phase, his whole thing is kind of going deep on research. And he just, in a fit of procrastination, apparently just decided to construct his own timeline. And he makes a very persuasive argument that, like, if you actually look at when this happened from beginning to end, he argues that Sonia was basically in the wrong entirely up until the point where Dawn gets the law involved. And I do think it's interesting that it is initially presented to us, I think, in an article that is very clearly less sympathetic to Dawn. I will say, just isolating the quote, "Do writers not care about my kidney infection?" is as efficient an assassination as I have ever seen. Yeah. Kudos to Robert Kolker. That was incredible. But I do think Dawn is kind of the most ostentatiously pitiful and excessive character. But I think part of the fun of this is like all the breadcrumbs are now out there and people can kind of dive into the raw materials, including the emails. The writer Jackie Shine found this incredible email from a writer whose name was Chip Cheeks, who runs into Dawn in a 4-person Spanish language baby class in El Segundo, which is a suburb of Los Angeles out by the airport. And Twitter then figured out that the same Chip Cheeks like had tweeted about getting an $800,000 advance for his novel. So everything is like looping back and connecting to other niche literary drama. But I do think that's part of what sustained this is there's just so much first-hand evidence out there that people can now go back and decide for themselves independent of Kolker's initial telling.
And it is a world that's kind of interesting to the outside viewer. I don't know anything about literary circles. I don't have several group threads with high literary minds, exchanging thoughts, salon style. It is kind of funny to see like, oh, we think of these folks as, or not necessarily that we deify them as may be suggested by what I'm about to say, but you tend to think of these folks as like introspective and thoughtful people who are working through their inspiration and trying to parse it responsibly because they care about their work and the impact that it has on others. And then you read something like this, and it's just as backbiting and gossipy as any high school clique. But I'm interested, Michael. I thought one of the things that you would want to dig into is just the notion. As a philosopher, I'm curious of your thoughts on, like, is there such a thing as a truly altruistic act? That's sort of the animating thing for this whole story that seems to have driven her up the wall to begin with. Is like, oh, okay, it's good to do a good thing, but do you have to crow about it?
Yeah, I mean, without getting too deep into the ethical nuance here, I mean, it does seem like a thing where I think the notion of a wholly 100% altruistic act, maybe not, and maybe if it is, it's the sort of thing you do like in the moment when you like save someone's life from the sinking ship or something. I think that the biggest red flag early in the article is how overtly that Dawn, I almost said the Dawn character as if this wasn't real life.
Sure.
How overtly Dawn is trying to present her act as altruism. It's like the paradox of the donor doth protest too much. Like the more in which you are trying to make clear that you are doing something altruistic, the more suspect it seems. And I think especially doing something good. And I think we live in an era of this, right? Like I have people who I like in my life who are very quick to get on social media and let you know, like, the thing they donated to. We know we live in an era where, like, people do very great photo shoots at protest and rallies so that you know they were there and that they were looking cool while doing it. It's like the world that we live in. But yeah, I think that the mixture of the ethical act and the sort of like promotion around the act and the desire of credit for the act, I think, not to be biblical, but there is a line I remember that I've used in like an ethics class before. I might get this kind of wrong, so if any biblical scholars listen, I apologize. I think it's in the New Testament, and I think Jesus says to someone, when you do your good deeds, like, let the left hand not know what the right hand is doing.
Sure.
Kind of this idea that if you're going to do something good, that's great, but like, do it and move on. Like, don't even let your other hand remember the thing. And I've always found that a kind of nice principle for altruistic acts. If you're going to do it and move on with it. Yeah. Like, if you're going to, even if it's as simple as like, I don't know, if you're going to meet an unhoused neighbor and buy them lunch or something like that, then don't go hang out with your friends and be like, guys, listen to what I did today.
You'll believe how sweet I was earlier.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like, maybe it can come up naturally, but I was thinking about that in the context of this. But I will say by the end of this, I shifted I had very little empathy for Dawn early on. By the end, I had a lot, because at the end of it, when you see those text messages, you do have that experience of like, and maybe this is a sort of like a sort of type of fragile narcissism, this sense of like, how horrible would it, like, what if my friends are like that? What if the people I think are my friends are on a group chat that I'm not on, being like, wow, what a pathetic sack this one is. And I do think that is
in a way just as narcissistic.
Yeah, it's just a narcissistic to worry about it, but it made me feel a lot of empathy for this person, because it does seem like early on she genuinely believed that she was like a part of this community, and then found out later that she wasn't. And I do think, especially in creative spaces, there's so much emphasis put on community, and whether that's literal community or like who your Twitter mutuals are, who you have DMs with, all this sort of stuff. And I think people, especially in creative fields where you're not having a lot of financial and like outward success, because I will be honest, I had not heard of these writers before this article. That does not mean that they're not great writers, but I feel like that participating in a community matters a lot. Alison, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's, I think you're right that you don't want to ostentatiously brag about your good deeds. And that sort of nullifies the good deeds. But I also think it's true that when people share their good deeds, often for good reasons, I mean, it's proven that when you share that you donate money on social media and you give the link, like, that leads more people to donate. I do think that also triggers a response in people where they're like, you know, it's kind of your instinct, like, shut the fuck up. Like, don't rub it in that I'm not doing this also. Not to say that it is not also legitimate to have gripes with the way Dawn presented herself, but I also think there's an ulterior motive of you kind of want to cast aspersions on other people so you don't feel as bad about not going to such extreme lengths, like literally donating a vital organ to a complete stranger. So I think that is an interesting motivation at play. And then also, I alluded to this earlier, but you know, Dawn did set up like a relatively small private group that was explicitly stated as like this. It apparently it says like in the head note, this is for me to share updates and like what I'm going through. There are similar like I have had friends and acquaintances who have gone through terminal illness or just serious illness, and there are like websites that are set up for you to like share medical updates. So I think so the head note says like, this is a space for me to share this. And it apparently also explicitly said, if you're not interested in that, feel free to leave, no hard feelings.
Okay.
And while I also think it is insane to check the analytics of that group and specifically follow up with people who don't respond to that, I think, you know, one of the things that Hobbs brought up is like, when she explicitly emailed Sonia and was like, hey, I noticed you're not engaging, like, do you not want to be a part of this? Is this not for you? Sonia could have taken the easy out. And it seems pretty clear that she, A, explicitly lied, and B, stuck around for the almost explicit purpose of gathering material. And that, I think, is when the bad art friend status starts to be a little more ambiguous. So I think both like there's a very understandable like adverse reaction to someone being obvious and explicit about their own good deeds, and then also, you know, responding to that with like the actively malicious intent of like, I am, and you know, it's like like you said, it's so horrible to not only find out like you're not part of a community, but also like that's literally a nightmare of, I like this was my fear, and I thought I was being paranoid when I thought that people were laughing at me, and actually it's true, and here's all the evidence. Like, I feel very confident that, you know, I'm a somewhat public figure. I'm sure people have talked shit about me in, you know, at least one group text out somewhere. I think the difference between me and Dawn is I would never, ever want to see it. I would never sue to get it. Although apparently the lawsuit that triggered that discovery was filed by Sonia, so that's another just like incredible irony at work here.
Shot herself in
the
foot there.
I think just I really feel for Dawn because I would not want to come across criticism of myself that's that explicit and brutal, even if I'm pretty sure it exists somewhere. Like, I feel very comfortable in my own ignorance.
Another thing I'm curious about, Alison, from your perspective, one thing that you alluded to earlier was also the notion of like one of the foundations of comedy being people caring too much about too little, just that sort of inherent pettiness of it all, sort of reflected in like Curb Your Enthusiasm as the first example that comes to my mind. But as someone who engages with and analyzes and critiques fiction professionally, do you have any thoughts on like who really owns a story? Who owns inspiration? Is it the creator? Is it the audience? Is it the inspirer, the inspiree? And how does that break down in your head?
I mean, I think as someone who really cares about fiction and is invested in the state of storytelling overall, I am generally very inclined to be on the side of the artist and the fictionalizer. You know, it is completely human nature that you take inspiration from what's around you, and the act of fiction is by definition, it is putting your own interpretation and spin on something that is out there. You know, like I think Curtis Sittenfeld is totally fine to write Rodham. I don't think Hillary Clinton owns her life rights in every possible respect, especially because she's, you know, a former candidate for president and first lady of the United States. She's the definition of a public figure. And I think a recent incident about this was the cat person, brouhaha, which for those of you who are not familiar, Cat Person was a viral short story written by Kristen Urpinian. And then a few months ago, a writer named Alexis Nowitzki, I believe, wrote an essay for Slate where she discovered that the original inspiration for Cat Person was her own relationship with an age gap that did not end super well. And I think one of the great things about that essay is she actually doesn't really take issue with Kristen Urpinian's right to take to take a seat of that. It's more just about the uncanny experience of like, this person's secondhand observation of my relationship did not align with my own experience. And that, in addition to the uncertainty of whether I was in fact the source material for this, was really disorienting. And it's not as concrete as like, she stole my life story, I can't believe she did that, which I think is really to the essay's credit. And I encourage everyone to read it. I think what happened with Sonia and Dawn is that Sonia did not sufficiently fictionalize the experience. And instead of it being about her as an artist, it instead becomes about a very literal act of theft of intellectual property, which is the basis for Dawn's legal case. So like, while I don't think Dawn is fully justified, I think Sonia really, really took a misstep, and it takes it out of that, headier who owns the right to a story and more like, well, that question's moot because you literally did take the story. But I will say, it's a totally valid question to ask. And I do think it is important to, in general, err on the side of the fictionalizer. It's just that this is a muddier situation.
Yeah.
And
we
I know
gotta
you're
wrap this up. So sorry, we're just running up against time here. So we should wrap this discussion up. If that's okay. Well, actually,
Sure.
none of it's okay.
I had one quick question though.
Very quick, if you don't mind.
Allison, I know you're a big fan of Phoebe Waller-Bridge. Is she your dream showrunner for the mini-series of this story?
Oh, that's great. I mean, I want to say it should be even. I want to see like Jesse Armstrong or like Armando Iannucci, like someone even meaner and pettier, or Larry David. I mean, I love Phoebe, but she's got Bond scripts to punch up.
Very cool.
Yeah. Well, also too, I mean, we're gonna have that legal battle, right? Because I'm sure someone's bought the rights to the story already, and now they can sue about their representation in the FX series or something. I don't know. I'm calling it. It's gonna be a Ryan Murphy thing. American Crime Story, Bad Art Friend. Okay, so we gotta wrap up, and I hate to wrap up because I love talking about this with y'all. And if you have not read that article and you've listened to this discussion and thought, what the hell are they talking about? Go read it. And if you're saying, I don't want to read it, listen to it. The New York Times has given you both of those options. Okay. But if you have read it, if the whole time we were talking about this, you were wanting to yell at us or butt in or tell us why we were wrong, please do it. And you can do that via email or phone. So you can email us at culturebinge@wisecrack.co. culturebinge@wisecrack.co, or you can call us at 213-534-8807, 213-534-8807. Don't have a lot of time, so just quickly want to shout out some people that wrote us emails about the last episode. We got a lot of emails in reference to the revenge nighttime procrastination topic we talked about, inspired by Anne Helen Peterson's newsletter and story about this. Jason brought up that we used to be so concerned with how jobs perceived us on social media, and now we've taken it back and are using it to show cracks in the workforce. So I think that was a cool point that Jason showed in there, that sort of we are being more honest about labor and work conditions and how those things come through in our life, and how through sharing that online, we're able to maybe recognize methods of exploitation in our lives and workplaces and ways we can sort of fight those, or at least sort of build solidarity. So I think that's very cool. Camille or Camille, depending on where you're from in the world, wrote us and said that they took 2 weeks off from work, but a higher up in the company still expected them to have their company phone on, even though their boss didn't. That sucks. Once again, like, all of this gets at the question that we've talked about in a lot of recent episodes, that we don't have the boundaries we should between those who we work for. A bunch of more emails about that from Kai, from DX, from a few others. We'll hopefully get to some of this in a future episode. But as always, thank you so much for getting in touch. Thank you so much for listening and jumping in the conversation. Before we go, I'll start with you, Allison. Where can people find you and your work on the internet?
Sure. So I mostly write at The Ringer. You can find me there. And there's a helpful little graphic under me that says @aherman2006, which is my handle on both Twitter and Instagram. It was once my AIM handle. And luckily that was PG rated enough that I could just take it into the future.
Amazing. Raymond, besides listening to you on our movie podcast, Show Me the Meaning, where else can they find you?
Yeah, as always, you can find me. I'm at Surrey Patel 22 on Twitter.
Wait a second.
So feel free to say hello.
Oh, that's on the screen. I thought it was a larger bit. You can find Raymond at Crematoria on Twitter and Letterboxd. Am I wrong?
Well, today you are, because today I am at Surrey Patel 22.
Okay, you know where he is. I'm Michael O'Burns on Twitter and on Instagram. Put some underscores around the O and you'll find me there. Also on Letterboxd now, so come find me if you want. I won't tell you where I am, but it's
yeah, you've been writing some good reviews.
You know, just chaotic after watching a movie, a little stoned at 2 a.m. Like here are my
look out, Alison Herman.
Whoa! Never! I would never. So thanks again to Alison for being here. Thanks again to Raymond.
Thank you so much, Alison.
Hopefully you'll both come back. This has been Culture Binge. We'll catch you in 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone.